Welcome to Doghouse Times, your source for dog and doghouse information. On this podcast, we're going to discuss doghouse foundations and what to put your doghouse on. Whenever you make or buy a doghouse, there's always the question of what you should put your doghouse on. What sort of foundation would be required for a doghouse anyway? And what would work the best? Well, that's why we're here today now, isn't it? We'll give you some awesome doghouse foundation tricks that'll save you time and money. So let's dig in, no pun intended. There are a number of easy to create foundations for doghouses. And there's a few things that we want to consider when we're selecting the type of foundation. The type you choose will depend upon a few different factors. Number one is permanence. How long do you want that doghouse to be in place? Will the doghouse be a permanent yard fixture, or will you take the doghouse mobile so you can choose different locations for it as the seasons change? Type of earth. The type of ground you're setting the doghouse on top of will also play a major factor when deciding the type of foundation to choose. For example, soft, wet yards should have a well-drained and raised foundation to avoid a wet and rotting doghouse, assuming the wood doghouse construction, of course. The grade of slope. Again, the ground is what we're looking at here. So we need to consider the slope of the yard and thus the drainage. The slope will play a factor in how we landscape the area and how you're going to level the doghouse, of course. Is it a kennel or is it a doghouse? If you live in a warmer climate than I do, then you might be keeping dogs outside year-round. If that's the case, you may be setting up a kennel with a doghouse attached or even inside a caged kennel area. The size of the kennel, where you intend the dog to do its business, and how long the dog is to remain in the enclosure all play important factors in how you will set the doghouse foundation up. Size and weight of doghouse. This, I think, is kind of straightforward. Naturally, the size and weight of any structure will determine the strength of the required foundation. I just make it simple and use an overkill technique. If it's overkill, it's probably good enough. Climate. If the ground goes through a freeze and thaw cycle each year, then you will need to take this into consideration when setting a foundation. The type of earth plays into this one heavily as well. This is especially important in areas which are not drained well and prone to high levels of freezing and ice within the soil due to those high water levels. Ice can, of course, expand and cause heaving. If you have the wrong kind of foundation, it can heave the foundation and cause all kinds of problems. Types of ground. So now we want to look at the composition of the soil in the ground and just get a general idea of what the stuff's made of. Sand. This can be difficult. I recommend a screw jack support foundation or even a helical pile. Dirt. This is, of course, your most common. And you can use most types of foundations with a well-drained dirt substrate. Drainage is your top concern, along with possible sinking or settling of the foundation, depending on the type. Next is mud or wet dirt. This is difficult to secure. Build up with coarse gravel until at least 2 inches above any sort of water level for a medium-sized doghouse. Ideally, set a secondary foundation or support on top of the gravel as an alternative support doghouses with stilt-style foundations, such as by using screwjack type of foundation supports. See the recommended foundation supports at the end of the article on doghouse-times.com/dog-house-foundations. The next type, of course, is swampy or marshy, and I do not advise setting a doghouse on a marsh. Find some solid ground. Water, forget it. Unless we're making a doghouse boat, which we'll cover, but not in this episode. So forget it for now. Now, looking at some foundation types. Concrete. Concrete is the quintessential permanent foundation type. And did you know that concrete is really quite inexpensive, but quite labor intensive to fabricate? Concrete mix bags can be purchased at most hardware stores in the US and Canada anyway, and run from $4 to $7 a bag. A medium doghouse typically uses about 4 to 6 bags to make a thin slab foundation. There's also a considerable amount of preparation required when fabricating a concrete foundation for your doghouse. The doghouse foundation is not intended to crack, sink, or settle, so we need to look at the type of ground and make sure we have the best possible drainage. To do this in most dirt types, what I recommend that you do is you dig down 4 to 6 inches into the ground and replace that with coarse gravel. Now the depth, of course, will depend upon the softness of the gravel, the softness of the soil. If you find it really easy to dig down 4 to 6 inches, then you might want to dig down a foot. If you dig down 4 to 6 inches and the gravel's really hard and compacted, then 4 inches is quite possibly, more than enough. I would replace that with coarse gravel, being 1/2 inch to 3/4 inch stones, and just pat that down, stamp that down, do whatever you can do to sort of compact that down, and then put your concrete slab on top of that. The idea is that the concrete will be raised slightly higher than the ground, and you use some of the dirt from digging out that hole to sort of make a little hill or a ramp around the edges of the hole where you put the concrete, so that it slopes down and away from the concrete slab. That's the idea. The ground should slope down and away when compacted from the concrete slab. And of course, having your gravel underneath. So, as written in the article on Doghouse Times, the concrete method tip. First, I would dig down about a foot. This tells me what kind of dirt I'm dealing with, as mentioned. I'm looking for a dirt with a high content of clay. This type of dirt is super compacted and hard to dig in. If this is the case, I might only dig down 6 inches. Next, I would lay down 4 to 6 inches of that coarse gravel that we discussed. After that, I would pour a layer of concrete over that to just cover the gravel with about 1 inch uniform layer of concrete. Because I'm not a fan of shifting and cracking concrete, I would then lay a wire mesh on the fresh and very wet 1 inch of concrete that I just poured, and then I would pour another inch of concrete on top of that mesh to sandwich it in to the center of the concrete. And that's going to leave me with about 4 to 6 inches of coarse gravel, permeated by 2 inches of concrete with wire mesh in the middle of the concrete. And that's what I would do for a medium-sized doghouse in hard compacted soil. For less dense soil, just dig deeper, add a deeper layer of gravel. Make sure to tamp down the gravel to pack it down as best you can before you pour any concrete on top. Many will say that the wire mesh is excessive and not necessary for such a small slab as you would make for a doghouse foundation. I disagree for the simple reason that adding mesh is so stupidly simple and barely costs more than a couple of dollars, and it definitely adds strength to hold the concrete together. That's why I say for a couple of dollars, why not? If it's intended to be permanent, make it permanent. That's my philosophy anyway. Patio stones. Moving on to our next type of foundation that you could use, patio stones. I've used the same method for the foundation prep as shown for the concrete, except with patio stones there is coarser grades of gravel and sand that I think they call it screenings that you want to use, but you want to look up using the proper installation of patio stones if that's how you want to do it, but I recommend concrete. But patio stones are basically just slabs of concrete that are already pre-paved. The problem I found with patio stones is that if you don't have a good base of gravel underneath, they will settle into the dirt, and over only a single year can become quite crooked and off level. And even if you do all the proper prep, if they're on any kind of dirt, over time they're going to settle. All patio stones settle. Gravel. A gravel foundation is fine as long as you still support the doghouse where it meets the gravel. If the doghouse is on a pole-like stilt, it will settle into the gravel, so a wide footprint is required if a stilt-structured design is the case. Gravel provides excellent drainage, and if patted down, can provide a stable and secure base for a doghouse. There's a couple considerations, though. Number one, the gravel should be made of a sort of hill or slightly raised area above the level of the dirt around it. This will improve drainage and airflow underneath the doghouse. 2. The gravel should not include quartz or be of a pure limestone composition. Quartz gravel is often containing multiple sharp shards. Treat quartz like broken glass. You wouldn't want your dog to walk on broken glass, just as you would not do barefoot yourself, at least I would hope. And limestone, with regards to limestone, it's not generally sharp like quartz. The issue with limestone is that it's quite basic in terms of its pH. When water's added to limestone, the stone can slowly dissolve into the water, making the water a base that can irritate or even chemically burn the skin. It can also alter the pH of the surrounding soil, which can harm your grass or garden potentially. So watch using the limestone. Recommended gravel that I would use is 1/2 inch to 3/4 inch sized, preferably, river washed, but that can get kind of expensive. But 1/2 inch to 3/4 inch sized gravel for most of the depth, and a 1 inch or 2 to 3 centimeter layer of pea-sized gravel on top. The gravel should be composed of granite for best results. Granite will last 1,000,000 years or more and will not affect the surrounding pH. Cinder blocks. A cinder block works fine as long as you've got a compacted base for them to sit on. Also, you may need to consider what size of cinder block you use, or you might need to use a ramp to get up to the doghouse door. There are cinder blocks that are fairly thin. You can get them, I think, about 3 inches, which is somewhere in the neighborhood of 9 centimeters. So those might work fine. The consideration with cinder blocks, or any form of brick or block for that matter, is the same consideration we have for using patio stones. These are heavy, solid blocks. You can lay them directly on the dirt, but don't expect them to stay level or on top of the soil for long. Any type of heavy block or stone will always sink into the dirt. Think of dirt as really, really thick liquid. Stones always sink in liquid, and likewise, they will always sink in the dirt. It just takes a lot longer, that's all. So if you want to use blocks, you're still going to need to dig down and use a gravel base with a solid, well-drained foundation for the blocks. It's the only way. Timber and wood. Timber or wood is most common building material for the doghouse if you're building it yourself. Therefore, wood is the most likely element of the doghouse to be touching the ground beneath it. I do not recommend using wood as a foundation unless you're using what I like to call the railroad technique. What is the railroad technique? First, just like with concrete, dig and form your gravel layer. Bring the gravel layer to about 1 inch or 2 centimeters below the dirt level. Next, lay 2 quote-unquote greased wood beams. And when I say greased, I mean that the wood has been stained and treated to prevent rot, and then also coated in a creosote or some other, paint or something, and coat it several times to make sure that you've got a thick protective layer to protect that wood even further. Although I would not use creosote, as the wood will be near the dog. I only use stains that would be safe for wood. You can get like stains for decks and stuff where people go, and those stains are going to be safe. They're going to be all right. Any stain that's safe for wood that people touch would be suitable for a doghouse as well. Same thing goes with any sort of paint to coat it after staining. I usually like to do it with a thick weatherproofing paint and apply several coats. Once it's fully dry, you pat the 2 beams down into the gravel and top the gravel up around them so that the gravel is then, when patted down, level with the top of the 2 beams that are laying down in the gravel, much like you would see in a railroad track with the beams embedded in the gravel. If you're using a nice thick beam like a 4x4, then the top surface of the beam that's exposed should be just above the level of the ground or the gravel surrounding it, and the gravel should be slightly higher raised than the ground around it. And again, you want to have a small slope with the dirt leading from the gravel away from the gravel, so that the entire area is slightly raised for better drainage. Lastly, we've got plastic. Now, I'm not a fan of plastic, so I'm not going to recommend its use for a foundation. However, if you were to use plastic as a foundation material, I would recommend using those solid composite beams that you can get at a lot of hardware stores, that you see those picnic tables and stuff made out of. It's like a recycled plastic, and using the railroad technique, minus the stain and paint, of course. Recommended ground screws for large dog houses are another thing that you could do, and I've got a link there on the site, doghousetimes.com/dog-house-foundations. I've got one on there that I have used before, and it works pretty well in semi-compacted soil. The soil that I was using it in is about 30% clay, so it's fairly compact, and those screws on there work pretty good, so check that out. I hope you've enjoyed this episode on Doghouse Foundations. If you have any suggestions or you'd like to hear about any other topics, feel free to leave me a comment. Don't forget to subscribe, and hope you've enjoyed it.